In this video, I'm going to go over our sort of framework for thinking about our public art project. In this art project, we are designing a proposal video for a piece of public art. And so I think it's important to have a little bit of context for what is public art? How does it function? What and who are the audience of a particular piece? And looking at a lot of contemporary examples of how this functions in space. So, what is public art? Some of the things that might come to mind immediately, like in our general settings, like buskers who are performing a activity, like people who are attracting a particular tourist crowd, performing a act on a public location, like a subway, a piazza, a boardwalk, and a beach, right? These are all addressing a general community, a community of people that happen to be passing by and bear witness to their particular artistic acts that they're doing. On Penn's campus, we have specific pieces of public art that are static, right? These are ones that are active. This is static in the sense that it is served as a method of identification of both the identity of campus and for the people that are there. You gather around and have your family or friends take photos in front of this, and you seek it out as a way to show you have been to this place. Things like the button, right? Popping up in the middle of it or hiding around it or sitting on top of it, right? These are these sort of identifiers of both fun in a place, but also they are your way of wayfinding. But then this comes back to the question of what is public, right? We're looking at examples of sculpture and performance, but what is public? And some of the things I like to do are to find out, the definitions of words, or either go to the etymology, but also looking at what is the sort of stock photo of what is identified as public. So this is the Shutterstock screenshot of Google search to see what particularly is public. And here we see this idea of both Wi-Fi, hands, restrooms, religious identification, this idea of public records, transportation, people in meetings. Usually there's one with a megaphone right here. So this idea of public is one that is about this communal space, right? It is not addressing an audience in particular, it's addressing everybody. When you're thinking about this in relation to space, because public art happens, it could happen online, it could happen in a public area where people are located. I think about places like the piazza in Siena in Italy, right? This large plaza, which is a public space, a gathering space in the middle of a larger city where there's commercial spaces down here and there are residences around, government buildings or religious buildings that are around the actual location, right? So you can see everything at once, right? If you're standing here, you can see other people gathering over here, and it becomes this way of seeing many things at once. Thinking about places like Hangzhou, I lived here for a while and would see this happening in the square right next to where I lived. And this was a sort of daily activity of people going out, exercising both in the morning, in the evening, and this way of creating a sort of communal activity. And notice that there's this sort of comparison happening here with these sort of stone spaces here as well, large viewing points where you can see everything happening at once. In Philadelphia, there's a space in Northern Liberties, which is now known as Schmidt's Commons, but originally was a development known as the Piazza. And I always think it's really fascinating to see the connection between this space as a public/private entity and here with this similar sort of brickwork and shops located on the bottom and residences or commercial spaces located above, right? So this idea that you can see everything, you can see this gathering of people starting to happen from all sort of different vantage points. It's the meeting of the personal, the leisure, and the business environment all coming together at once. But then I start to think about what is an intervention in these spaces. Something really small, like putting a small tiny rope around something very gentle, something that happens to be coming out from the bricks underneath, right? Drawing attention to something that is less seen or readily in our consciousness or awareness. You can also think about interventions same way as murals, right? This is an artist named Blue who is known for creating these videos where these animations of graffiti in public spaces, right? And I think about the sort of contract that has to be made in order to produce something like this, right? This is a stop motion of graffiti happening on a space. This is not something that is happening in one day. It's happening in many, many hours, many days over a period of time because of the labor that's happening there. So, this is public art in the sense that it is not just unto itself. There are a lot of actors and negotiators that are happening in the bureaucratic system to be able to have something like this occur. But at the same time, it makes you think about the actual environment differently. It makes you think about what is the role of graffiti. In this piece by the Carmichael Collective, coming up with this idea of planter tags for everyday objects. We pass by a fire hydrant, but what is the sort of taxonomy behind it? What is the sort of playfulness that we can bring to our everyday life to draw attention to it, right? Placement 2 to 3 every block. There's something really silly about this, but it's also, it brings the idea of a system back down to our sort of local level. And so these ones are kind of fun in the sense that, they're playful, but in some regards, like as artists, there's a responsibility that you have in terms of making work in public. And I like this quote from Michelangelo Pistoletto, who is an artist who is part of the Arte Povera movement. And he has this quote: "Art must bring its unique perceptual sensibility to every system, whether productive, organizational, or political, to carry out the composition of its various parts, understood as the harmonious elements of the civil concert. The lack of this sensibility is the cause of the sclerosis of every individual organism." So in this, thinking about how art, exists within a system, which is in many different parts, could be social, could be political, could be economic, and that this phrase, the harmonious elements of the civil concert, that it's all of these parts are moving together and they're interconnected. And art is this way of finding the how these things work and weave together, or where they break down, and that it is an awareness to this civil concert or this sort of movement in society, and that if there isn't an attention to it, there's a sclerosis, there's sort of breaking down or hardening of how we function. And I think in this case, this is a very optimistic view of what art can do, which I appreciate. And so, these questions of what control does the artist have in a public space and how has it changed over time, I think are good questions to be asking yourself for when you're developing your own proposals. Like, what, A, who is your audience? And B, how has this changed? And how do you sort of address that audience? And what sort of control do you have, if any, in terms of creating a certain outcome, if you want a certain outcome to be made? Hans Haacke had this piece in 1970 called The MoMA Pole, where this was a work that, in some sense, is a visualization that was installed in MoMA in the 1970s. And the question being asked was, would the fact that Governor Rockefeller has not denounced President Nixon's Indochina policy be a reason for you not to vote for him in November? If yes, please cast your ballot in the left box. If no, please cast in the right box. Now, something like this takes on this idea of institutional critique. Rockefeller was on the board of MoMA, and this was seen as this way of addressing the policies and politics of the particular institution where this was being shown. And as you can see, yes being much higher than no here, indicates that there was some internal disagreement about the politics of the institution. And so this idea that the artist is separate from the place where it's being shown, or that the artist has the ability to critique the system wherein it's being supported, it's complicated, and it brings up these really great sort of questions. Looking at a couple other pieces, Agnes Denis, this is a work called Wheatfield, A Confrontation, where this was in 1982, and you can see here that the two towers are still standing. And she was given a plot of land in just near Wall Street on the west side of the Hudson, where she remediated it. It had been just sort of an abandoned site. She remediated it and grew this large field of wheat right in downtown Manhattan. And this was a property that was given that she was able to use through the Dia Foundation and Arts Foundation. And what was really interesting is this property was worth a lot of money, right? To grow wheat on this space kind of turned the idea of what a space's capital is really used for. And to see this juxtaposition of wheat being grown in downtown New York City is really striking. So it's about both the metaphorical nature of it, the conceptual idea, but also the aesthetic gesture of an environmental consciousness taking place in this idea of extreme commerce and wealth. Andy Goldsworthy is someone who also creates these sort of aesthetic gestures in the landscape, using found objects to create, using found natural objects such as stones and wood to create these really beautiful gestures within a space. And usually they take the form of just working over a solitary day, and then the end result is this one photograph of what this thing is. So whether it's collecting rocks or sticks and organizing them into a system, drawing attention to the landscape itself. And this example on the right, this is coming from a place called Storm King, where instead of having a wall really, draw a space between trees, where normally you would move the trees out of the way in order to create this wall, he really let the wall navigate and weave its way around the trees and even go into the water, and it continues up on the other side. In thinking about sort of filmic and photographic interruptions in space, there's a biennial exhibition called Desert X, and in this iteration, Jennifer Boland did this piece where on these billboards set throughout the highway, she took photographs of the land right behind the space itself. And so as you're driving, these billboards would line up in this perfect photographic way with what was happening right behind it. And so there's this really interesting moment of expectation where you're like, is it going to line up? Is it going to line up? It lines up. Like, you're really excited about it. And, this is, I think there were about 10 of them that were all in a row. And it's this way of reconstituting commercial space into a more sort of general like space itself. Two artists who are really well known for creating gestures around public buildings were Jean-Claude and Christo. And Jean-Claude has passed away, but Christo still continues to make work. And this was a piece where they covered the Reichstag in Germany completely in fabric. And this is one where, this idea of wrapping an entire building takes a lot of organization. It takes a lot of bureaucratic wherewithal to really get through and navigate this sort of space of coming to an agreement of permissions to do this. This is a government building. And so getting all parties to agree to this, I think, is as much part of the art as the actual gesture. Christo is also known for, in 2016, these links between these islands called the floating piers. And so these were these large floating structures that allowed people to walk from land to this island in the middle of the water on these fabric covered objects. And so this is part of the sort of language that they'd used of drawing attention to space, a really ambitious, years long project. Francis Alise is an artist. So in this video, he is pushing around this block of ice. There's this act of labor that's involved, right? Where, you're thinking about the cold on his hands. You're thinking about this sort of Sisyphean act of moving something impossible from one space to another, right? It's melting as it's going along. It's clearly a warm, sunny day. It's leaving wet tracks as it goes. And he goes through this entire act of moving it through the city until it totally melts, and you can see that the color of the light has changed, so obviously a lot of time has passed until it gets down to its very last element. So this is this sort of performative aspect, right? He's showing time moving through space here, and really letting the act dictate how he's sort of moving, and it becomes really poetic, right? This sort of movement through a gesture like this. This piece, When Faith Moves Mountains, lined up a whole range of people to literally try and move a mountain, where one shovel at a time, taking the geological scale of how you would move a space, how you would move a mountain, right? Thinking about erosion, thinking about extraction, and taking this and really, having a whole line of people do this, right? It's this performative act, but it's also poetic in the sense. And when you see it on the scale from zooming out from, I think I've seen this as either a plane or helicopter view of watching the whole line of people move this mountain, right? It's this act of belief, and it's also this act of physicality that is really overwhelming when you see this whole line of people. And this is a piece that I did 2 years ago in 2018 called Floating Archives, where I made animations based on archival images, the Schuylkill River, and then projected them on a floating platform as moving up the Schuylkill River. And so in this piece, we moved up the river, and people were able to see the projections of each animation playing on the screen. And we played each animation at the particular point that each place referenced. So as we passed the South Street Bridge, we would play the animation based on that image of the South Street Bridge. And there were about 50 animations total. And it was this way of creating a playful gesture in history, but also this idea of doubling the idea of landscape and history. So you can see both sort of happening at the same time. Thinking about the place where you are, but the place, what it was like in the past, and the potential for the future. More recent investigations into public art include creating PPE for Antonio Lopez Garcia's day. This day sculpture is the one that's actually present outside the MFA in Boston, the Museum of Fine Arts. And this artist, Peter Agus, wanted to give it personal protection equipment in order to raise awareness of this idea that there's a limited supply and doctors and medical staff don't have enough and essential workers don't have enough protective equipment to keep them safe in the current pandemic. And so this way of drawing attention to a current political and health-oriented climate. The Teeter-Totter Wall was from Ronald Rael and Virginia Sanfratello, two artists who created this way of people across the southern border to interact and play. So instead of creating this site of this site being one of tension and trauma, it's really become one of, or it would have the potential to become one of play, and sort of neuter to become one of. So it really drew attention to the site as one of play and connection between families that are located on both sides of the wall. Jeremy Deller is a British artist who also deals with Jeremy Deller is also an artist who deals with trauma from a sort of global perspective. And in the 1980s, there was a mine strike in Britain where Margaret Thatcher said, the mines need to be reopened. There was a strike, and the police came in, and there was a lot of violence against the actual miners protesting. And so what Jeremy Deller did is he was looking at the idea of reenactments, this sort of trope of this way of reenacting history, right? Civil War reenactments, American Revolution reenactments, and thinking about how we could use that as a way to restore peace or heal the people who lived in this particular town. And so what he did is he hired and created a reenactment of the actual mine strike, and had the people who had been police officers at that time play the role of the miners, and the miners play the role of the policemen. And so it was this really interesting way of one side being able to relive the perspective of another. In 2009, he had this piece called It Is What It Is. This car was destroyed by a bomb in a Baghdad marketplace on March 5th, 2007, and sort of took this around the country. It was displayed in a lot of museums. But this act of driving it around and bringing a piece of the conflict abroad more readily into our vision on highways, in shopping malls, in art institutions, really brings home this idea of things that were happening, outside of our country, but that our country was readily engaged in. Bread and Puppet Circus, they are a collective of activists and artists in Vermont who stage these really large performances of puppetry as part of it, and marches to talk about actions that are happening politically. There's an artist named Mary Mattingly who does a lot of works around how we perceive and interpret landscape. And she's created these sort of artistic gestures, one called Wetland, which is in Philadelphia. And this was a wetland, this was a fully self-sustaining habitat where they hosted artists coming through, performances. There were floating gardens, as well as chickens and beehives, and solar panels on this boat that kind of looked like it was a townhouse sinking into the water. And it became part of Penn program in the Environmental Humanities and made its way down to Bartram's Garden. And this piece called Swale was taking on the question of edible forests in New York City. This was one where in New York City you're not allowed to harvest plants from parks, so you can't go out and so you aren't allowed to harvest things from parks. And so what she did is she got around that by getting a barge and filling it with edible plants, and this idea of the donkey, and in that way became outside the park system. People could come and harvest crops, learn about growing food, and it's continued on. So I think it was started about 4 or 5 years ago, and it's still continuing. And this was the sort of mock-up photo. But if we look at Swale here, we should see, right, this beautiful sort of landscape on a boat, right? So taking this sort of untraditional way of thinking about land in an area and transporting it to a place of being on water and making it more accessible for people, right? In some ways, it's an impossible project, right? This idea of, this piece is by Krzysztof Wadiczko called Tijuana Projection. And he is an artist who is known for using technology and video in really creative and interesting ways. And in this piece, there's a cultural building in Tijuana that has this globe-like shape. And what he did is he developed this camera to film someone's face and project it perfectly on this globe. And what he did is he asked people and worked with community groups there, to talk to people who'd been victims of either domestic abuse or community violence. And these people could then share their stories in a very public manner. There was a large projection and audio of their voice happening live as a way to sort of give voice to people who might not normally have that arena or that loud platform. And this is something he's done in many different respects, connected to traumatic events such as Hiroshima or the Vietnam War. And we'll look at an example of video from him next week. Monument Lab is I've talked about this a bunch, but they are a group at Penn who have Monument Lab is another group Monument Lab is a group of curators and artists housed at Penn who bring a lot of attention to the role of what a public monument should be for a particular place. So it started out with this question of what is an appropriate monument for the city of Philadelphia? And in 2017, they had a huge citywide exhibition bringing 20 different artists to Philadelphia or from Philadelphia to do a public work. So pieces like these stoops from Caitlin Pomerantz, who also teaches at Penn, that were located in Washington Square Park, that were brought in from houses that had been demolished. And so it was this idea of reclaiming a public space that you might see outside in neighborhoods where people sit on the stoop and bringing it to a place that is public, but also it almost feels like a memorial or like a legacy. These other examples of creating monuments and plinths for women who should be celebrated in the city but don't have monuments to them yet. And so there's about 20 documented, and they've continued on hosting a nationwide public program where they brought in artists from all over to do this national conversation, and it's continuing. So I really recommend looking at this. And then we've got this idea of the sort of social public art. One person who is known for doing this idea of relational aesthetics, this how we communicate with other people, is a way of thinking about art in the public sphere. There's an artist named Rikritir Vanija, and he will often take over a gallery space and cook curry or some meal for people who visit. And it's this idea that you have food and you're given a free meal and you sit down and have a conversation with other people that might be there as well. Now, the question comes up of is this a free meal? What is the sort of institution that's paying for this? And so oftentimes it's this way of talking as much about the conversations that people might have amongst themselves, but also this relationship between capital and art, and how they're really, really intertwined together. This is a work from Maya Chow and Josephine Devenbew, which is called Look at Art, Get Paid. And it is a work that they started at the RISD Art Museum, which is the museum that's associated with RISD. It costs money to go inside. And they were finding that it wasn't actually addressing the people of the community that live there. So as part of her project, as part of their project, they work to get people who wouldn't normally come to the museum and give them cash to be visiting critics. And it was people who might not have English as a first language or accessibility issues, and come and visit the museum and then give feedback and talk about their experience of being there. And what's amazing is this actually caused changes at the museum itself, in terms of creating more programming that had literature that was not just in English, that had Spanish and Portuguese as part of it, but also drawing advertising in neighborhoods that they didn't see as people that would actually come to the museum, to doing exhibitions that were more culturally appropriate for the people who live in Providence. And so there's this started out as an art project, but it's continued on to other museums. And so it's interesting to think about this as a public intervention in a way to draw attention to the institutionality, but the way that people are navigating and addressing their own relationship to cultural institutions. So this is a lot of work to think about. This document has links to each artist that's sort of discussed, and I skipped over a couple. And if we go to the bottom of the document here, you'll see that there are a whole bunch of links that go through and really talk about each individual artist that was discussed here. For the most part, I need to add a couple for the last one that was here. But there's videos that are associated here, as well as documentation. So I really recommend, if like there was one thing that stood out to you, do some more research and think about how you can be inspired by these artists as well as your own individual research.